Good afternoon. Hope you are all doing great. Sorry, this is the only background I could afford you because I'm in my family house, so this is all what I managed to do. Um, yes, so this is our first YouTube lecture. Let me first comment on the previous material we covered. I just wanted to say that what I mentioned in the questions about Dover's beach and are you digging on my grave is what is included. The Victorian period included both poets and prose writers, and when I say prose writers, I mean novel writers in particular. So I prefer to focus on prose because we've studied enough poetry in this course. So what we mentioned in the questions regarding Dover's beach and are you digging on my grave is what is included. I also for you asked you to watch the video, and I hope you managed to watch it. The video is about the Victorian poets and prose writers. There are major points that you need to know, and I'll highlight them here. So she's talking about similar ideas we discussed in class, if you can remember. At the beginning of the Victorian period, we have done like a historical survey, and she's doing the same. She's mentioning how the growth of population affected London in particular and England in general. And she talks about the industrial and imperial power during the Victorian period. Well, that's important because it has an impact on England. Well, from the 18th century till now. So the impact is that there started to be a widely educated public. In terms of literature, novel became the dominant genre, and it represented the broad social world. Literature started also to serve a moralizing purpose. It reflected disappointment and alienation, and she's giving Tennyson as an example of melancholy. Melancholic sentiment was influential during that period. And also literature registered decay and moral corruption. And we will see, these are ideas, but we will apply them to the text we will be studying from now on, mainly novels. She's mentioning an important point and a characteristic of Victorian poetry, which is the dramatic monologue. It's in Arabic monologue. So the dramatic monologue, where a character speaks unmediated by a narrator. So the voice is left to the character, and that's a dramatic monologue technique. So the point of view is subjective, and we will discuss this by giving example when we start studying the novels we should study. And she gives the example of a novelist, Stevenson. He's a Gothic fiction writer, and how his writing reflects the duality of human nature, and that's very important. You will notice we won't be studying Stevenson in particular. This video is important because it highlights the idea of dramatic monologue, the impact of the growth of population and industrial and revolution on literature in general, and how literature started to reflect the decay and the disappointment of the people. So these are the ideas which I found important and which you need to understand, because we need to apply them to the novels we will be studying. So we won't study Stevenson. We'll start with George Eliot, and we'll try to apply what we've studied about the characteristics of the Victorian period to his novel. So yeah, double life, duality, dramatic monologue are all characteristics of the literature of the Victorian period. The first novel included in your book, and it's just the book includes only part of the novel, is The Mill on the Floss, written by George Eliot. And I'm not sure if you know this, George Eliot is a pseudonym. So the real author of this novel is Mary Evans, a female writer. So she used a pseudonym, a man's name, in order to write. And some of you might say, why? Because in the 18th century, women started to write. They started to perform on the theater, and that's true. That's true, but that was an exception, not a commonplace, not the rule. So she felt, Mary Evans, she felt the need to write under the name of George Eliot, a man's name. So this novel, The Mill on the Floss, is written by Mary Evans under the name of George Eliot. I'll just give you a brief summary of the novel, and I expect you to read the part you have in your book, and maybe we'll add some parts. We'll focus more on Pygmalion, another novel, but we need also to apply certain ideas to this novel. So it covers, the novel covers the period of 10 to 15 years after 1820s, which means after war. And we discussed the impact of war on literature. So this novel was written after war. And it covers 10 to 15 years. It narrates the life of sibling living on the river Floss. The place is England, but that specific Floss is a river, by the way. Floss is a river, and that's the place, that's the setting of the novel, but it's fictional, which means there's no river called Floss in England. So this is fictional, but it is in England. It is in England. So it's the story of a brother and sister, Tom and Maggie Tulliver. The protagonist is the sister, Maggie Tulliver. The story begins when she is 9 years old, and then it continues for like 10 to 15 years. So the important events are that she falls in love with Philip Wakem, and Philip Wakem is a hunchback and sensitive intellectual friend. She falls in love with him, but her family and her brother in particular are not happy with that. So her brother forces her to renounce her relationship with Philip. The family goes bankrupt, and Tom also leaves school to help his father financially, to work and support the family. After that, Maggie, the protagonist, the heroine of, but in you know, we say hero and heroine in epic poetry, in medieval poetry, but not in modern poetry or modern fiction. So in modern fiction, we tend to say the protagonist, because a protagonist might be not a hero. A hero is someone who's perfect. A protagonist is the major character, but someone who can be perfect or not. So that's why we call the major character a protagonist, not a hero in modern fiction. Yes, so her brother forces her to renounce the relationship with Philip. Then her friend invites her into her house for a period of time, for like months, and she falls in love with her friend's fiance. Can you see? So Maggie, the protagonist, falls in love with her friend's fiance. Here the struggle begins because, and that's duality. This is something we need to apply. That's duality. This is the Victorian literature. It's a type of literature which registers such feelings being divided, the struggle she feels. So she is now struggling. There is a conflict between her feelings towards her friend's fiance and her moral responsibility. That's her friend. She shouldn't do that. She shouldn't feel such feelings. So what happens is that Stephen, he's called Stephen, her friend's fiance. They travel together. I mean, Maggie and Stephen. Stephen is her friend's fiance, and he proposes to her. And the novel registers that sentiment, the feeling of division. How Maggie is just divided between her love for Stephen and her love for her friend, her moral responsibility, what she should do. So passion and reason, emotions and reason. And that's a characteristic of Victorian literature. So he proposes for marriage. She takes her time, she thinks a lot. She experiences conflict, and then she refuses, and she goes back to her to her city. But her friend and her brother refused to forgive her at the beginning. But then a flood happens, and they forgive her because of the circumstances. But she and her brother don't together. So this is the ending. This is the conclusion. So both of them die in the flood. That's just a brief summary of the novel. I want you to read the part you have in the book, and we need to figure out the elements of the plot. This is very important when reading novels, or fiction in general. So you need to get trained into figuring out or discussing the elements of the plot. We have certain elements of the plot, which are the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. The exposition is the beginning of the story. Characters and setting are established and the conflict is introduced. So this is the beginning of the story. It's called exposition. The rising action is when conflict and complication begin. This is called rising action. So the conflict and complication begin. Then we have the climax. The climax is the highest point of tension. The climax of dhurwa, the highest point of tension and the most dramatic event of the story. Then we have the falling action, when the story begins to slow down. And finally, we have the resolution, when the story ends and concludes. So we have the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. These are the elements of the plot. You need to understand these, and we need to apply them to the mill on the floor. So next time we will comment on the novel. We'll figure out, we'll apply these elements to The Mill on the Floss, and we'll discuss other issues. But you need to read the part you have in the book, and we'll comment on certain parts of the novel. So I hope this helps. This is just an introductory lecture to the Victorian novel, which is the most important genre during that time. I would say take care of yourself and study hard. Give some time to your paper. Don't forget about that. And it will be on this. I think I will do an announcement very soon, inshallah. It will be due, I think, on the 17th of April. We'll see. Take care.